Good evening. It's great to see you tonight. It's the Wednesday before Christmas, isn't it? Man, this one it's honestly sneaking up on me so fast. It's hard to keep track of all that's going on. Well, you know what? We've got some great things going on this weekend for the Christmas season, and we're looking forward to just focusing our attention upon Him. We really need to in these days and these times, and so looking forward to all that God's going to do. But tonight, we're going to finish Genesis 49 tonight. So if you would open your Bibles to that particular chapter, we're going to be going through it together before we go into communion. It is possible to live under a delusion, to think that you're kind, considerate, gracious when really you're not. You think that you're putting positive things into other people and leaving a legacy behind, and if you could really check 20 years later, you'll find out that it really wasn't the case. What if you could read your own obituary? How do people really see you? There's a story about a man who actually did get to read his own obituary. One morning in 1888, a man named Alfred, he was the inventor of dynamite, awoke to read his own obituary. The obituary was printed as a result of a simple journalistic error. You see, the brother of Alfred died. And so the reporter, being a little bit careless, reported on Alfred's death rather than his brother's. And so, to his shock, he was reading his own obituary the following morning, and he saw himself the way the world did. They called him the Dynamite King, the great industrialist who made an immense fortune from explosives. This, as far as the general public was concerned, was the entire purpose for Alfred's life. None of his true intentions to break down the barriers that separated man and ideas for peace were recognized or given serious consideration. He was simply a merchant of death. And for that alone, he would be remembered. As he read the obituary with horror, he resolved to make clear to the world the true meaning and purpose of his life. This could be done through the final disposition of his fortune, his last will and testament, an endowment of 5 annual prizes for outstanding contributions in physics, chemistry, medicine, literature, and peace, and then a 6th category of economics was added later. And this would be the expression of his life's ideals, and ultimately would be what people would remember him by. The result was the most valuable of prizes given to those who had done the most for the cause of world peace. It's called today the Nobel Peace Prize. And so here's a guy that realized that, you know what I'm being remembered for is not what I want to be remembered for. And Jacob now, as we get into Genesis chapter 49, is given an opportunity to leave something behind, leave something that his sons will remember him by. Words that they will not only remember, but they will grow and they will pass along to their own kids. And so he calls a family gathering together, starting in verse 1 of Genesis 49. And Jacob called his sons and said, "Gather together, that I may tell you what shall befall you in these last days. Gather together and hear, you sons of Jacob, and listen to Israel, your father." And so as he sees the end approaching, he gathers his sons around them, and they gather into his room, and they gather around his bed. And if you've ever been to one of those type of meetings, which I have, where you're just, I don't know whether it's for the people that are going to be left behind or for the person that's actually getting ready to say goodbye, but that meeting so often happens just to make clear that, this is what I'm leaving behind. This is what this whole thing looks like. And so this invitation to have his sons around, and really Jacob's last act was to give the very first conscious prophecy in the Bible. Now, there have been other prophecies before this, but this is the first time in the Bible that a man actually prophesies, actually gives future events that are going to happen to other people, in this case being his sons. And so from verse 3 to verse 27, you're going to see that he has a word to each of his 12 sons. Each one of them has something really kind of tailor-made and prophetic, if you will, for each one of them. And so we start off in verse 3, and in verses 3 and 4, actually verses 3 through 7, we see three of the sons that were actually disqualified. In verse 3, he says this, Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might, and the beginning of my strength, the excellency of dignity, and the excellency of power. Now stop right there for a second, because when he speaks to Reuben, he's speaking to his oldest son, the firstborn. And as the firstborn, there's some responsibilities that go along with that, but there's also some perks that go along with that. The responsibilities are, you are now going to be the leader of this family. That's the firstborn responsibility. You're to be the spiritual leader, the one that looks out for the rest of the family. You're the patriarch now. That's the responsibility. The perk, you get a double inheritance. So what everybody else got, you got double that. Guess that's the price you pay for being responsible. And so he says, Reuben, you're the firstborn. You are the one in that prime position, that dignified position, that place of power. But what does he go on to say? He says, unstable as water, you shall not excel. Because you went up to your father's bed, then you defiled it. He went up to my couch. And so all of a sudden, the 11 other brothers go, it really stinks to be you right now, dude. Dad just called you out for something that happened 40 years previously, where Bilhah, Rachel's maid, if you will, and really the mother of two of his brothers, Reuben slept with the mother of two of his brothers. That's just kind of weird, whatever way you want to look at it. That's just bizarre. But he did that. And at that time, 40 years previously, we don't really hear anything about it. Nothing gets said. But now, 40 years later, on his deathbed, Jacob feels like that's the significant thing that he has to point out to his son about himself. He says, you're unstable as water. You will not excel. Instability is a poor quality to have in a person. Terrible quality to have in a leader. James chapter 1 talks about a double-minded man. And a double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. You just can't count on a double-minded man. On the other hand, stability and consistency are a quality that are so vital. When we see Paul going to speaking to the Ephesian elders in Miletus, he says, you know from the first day I lived among you, how I always lived among you, how I always was. In other words, there was a stability and a consistency in Paul's life that he says, you guys could bank on me. And I don't think he said that in a prideful way. He's just talking about the reality of the fact that he realized the importance of consistency in life. And so Jacob's saying, Reuben, you don't got that. Stability and consistency are qualities that are developed starting young. It's such an important lesson. And I don't know if Cynthia and I did it right, but one of the things we did want to instill in our own kids is the importance of consistency. And because of that, we didn't let them quit anything. If they started something, it's like, I don't care if you don't like it, you finish it out. You start a season in this sport, you don't like it, too bad, you finish it out. You finish what you started. You learn to be consistent. Now, at the right time, in the right way, if you want to step out, that's fine. But to coddle somebody and say, oh, you don't like that, go ahead and quit. You just taught them to be inconsistent. And so consistency is something that's developed and cultured because quality things happen over the long haul, not the short term. Most of the good things that will happen in any person's life happen over the long haul, not the short term. An overnight success it's a pipe dream. It's a misleading reality. Is it impossible? No, it's not impossible. But is it likely? No, it's not likely. The reality is most of the things that happen to people happen because they've been consistent at something for a while. And so in Reuben, he sees inconsistency and says, because of that, you're not going to excel, Reuben. And if we look through the history of that tribe, what you'll find is there was never a prophet. There was never a king. There was never a leader. There was never a significant person that came out of Reuben's tribe. There's just something about the instability that got passed along. So he says, Reuben, it's kind of a bummer, but your instability, your inability to take control of yourself, it cost you. Then in verses 5, 6, and 7, Simeon and Levi, these are the next two oldest brothers in line. This is number 2 and number 3. Instruments of cruelty are in their dwelling place. Let not my soul enter their council. Let not my honor be united to their assembly, for in their anger they slew a man, and in their self-will they hamstrung an ox. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their anger, for it is cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. And so the next two oldest, Simeon and Levi. If you remember their story and what happened, they had a sister named Dinah. Dinah got raped, for lack of a better word, by a guy named Shechem. In the process of that, they kind of grew attracted to one another, and so they worked out a way that Shechem, this young man, could actually marry Dinah, and it was a rather complicated thing, but they pulled it off. They said, we'll give you our sister, but all the men in your city have to be circumcised, because we couldn't possibly give our sister to a community that was not circumcised. And I guess this guy must have really been in love with her, because he somehow convinced every man in that city to be circumcised. I could see that town hall meeting. Guys, got some news for you. Well, it says on the second day, when all these guys were kind of laid up a little bit, Simeon and Levi went in with the sword and killed every male in the city. They took the women and the children as slaves. They took all their livestock. In other words, they acted like terrorists. They pillaged the entire city. I mean, there's setting things straight, and there's getting an unrealistic amount of revenge. And that's what Simeon and Levi did. And so again, years later, Dad says, you guys, you were excessively harsh, completely cruel, and that anger is a trait that will hold you back. It will cost you. It defiles you. The Bible says the wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God. Anger is a problem so many of us struggle with. How many people don't get angry at things? And sometimes we just justify it. We say, well, I know I get angry, but it's over in a moment, and after that it's calm. So is a shotgun blast, right? Shotgun blast is over in a moment, and then it's calm. But man, what kind of damage can be left behind by one shotgun blast, one explosion, one bomb blast? And so he says, you guys, your anger, it's costing you. And so one of the things we learn from these three brothers is the fact that our past actions can have current consequences. These are events that happened decades before that no real significant consequences were felt then, but now years later, as Jacob is on his deathbed, he brings these things back and says, hey, we have an issue. There's a problem that needs to be addressed in you. And to hear that and to see that, I don't know what you think, but when I see that, in my mind I go, oh no. Because what if my past is brought back to me, or the things that I've done in my stupidity, or in my anger, or in my foolishness, or in my rebellion? What's going to happen to me if it costs Reuben, and it costs Simeon, and it costs Levi? And I think Simeon and Levi are a pretty good example of how we can respond to this. Because what we see in Simeon and Levi is indeed, he says, I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. In other words, Simeon and Levi, you guys are going to be scattered. You guys are going to be dispersed. But look at the difference between the two. Simeon started off as a fairly strong tribe, but it ended up being one of the very weakest tribes. And ultimately, it was dispersed. It just kind of got consumed or assimilated by the tribe of Judah. It just kind of disappeared. On the other hand, Levi was also dispersed, but dispersed in a different way. And how so? Because in that time, in that moment where the entire nation was kind of rebelling against God, Levi stood up and said, no, we are going to be faithful to God. We're going to do the right thing. And in that, God made note of that. And so, yes, the Levites were dispersed, but how were they dispersed? They were dispersed in cities throughout the nation because they, of course, became the priestly tribe. They became the ones that represented God. And the Bible says that the Lord was their inheritance. They had a special place and position. In other words, God took that, if you will, that curse, that consequence, and he brought something good out of it. Why? Because they were willing to say, you know what? We can't undo the past, but what we can do is stand for the Lord right now. And we can do the thing that's right in this moment. And in doing that, the Lord took that bad consequence and he turned it into a real blessing, because the Levites, what an important tribe, what an important role they had within the entire nation of Israel. They were the representatives of God to the people. And that's God taking a bad situation and turning it into something good. And so we see the first three, and if you're up next, you're probably thinking, oh man, this is not working out well for anybody. But it gets better, because in verse 8, Judah, you are he whom your brothers shall praise. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's children shall bow down before you. Judah is a lion's whelp. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He bows down, he lies down as a lion, and as a lion, who shall rouse him? So what we see in verses 8 and 9 is what we've seen kind of consistently over the past several chapters, and that is Judah's stock is rising, right? Not a perfect guy, we know that. Thing with his daughter, not good. Thing with wanting to sell his brother, not good. But over the last few chapters, he's kind of stepping up a little more. He's taking responsibility. He says, I'll look out for Benjamin. Even if it costs me, I will take care of my little brother. He's done some things right, and his stock is rising. And so now, Jacob looks to Judah and says, you're the one your brother's going to praise. You're the one that's going to be indomitable like a lion. Verse 10, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh comes. And to him shall be the obedience of the people, binding his donkey to the vine and his donkey's colt to the choice vine. He washed his garments in wine and his clothes in the blood of grapes. His eyes are darker than wine and his teeth whiter than milk. And so what does he say about Judah? He says, the scepter, the authority of the nation, will not leave until Shiloh comes. Shiloh, the idea, the word Shiloh or the name Shiloh has a meaning. And that meaning is something along the lines of to whom it belongs or to whose right it is. And of course, when he says Shiloh's going to come through your tribe, through your family, Judah, well, that happens through a guy named David. And David becomes a long line of kings. Of course, you had Saul, then you had, who was a Benjamite, then you had David and his sons. And after that, you have a whole line culminating 1,600 years later in the person that we celebrate this weekend, coming of Jesus. Okay, so Shiloh is the one who it belongs to. Jesus himself comes through the tribe of Judah. That's why in Revelation 5:5, he is called the Lion of the tribe of Judah. He is that lion. He's the one that came through Judah's family. And so he's kind of saying, props, Judah. You're in a good place. You're blessed. Now, in verses 13 and moving forward, we look at some of the other brothers. The other brothers aren't as much of note as the previous oldest four. Zebulun shall dwell by the haven of the sea. He shall become a haven for ships and shall adjoin Sidon. And so Zebulun, up by the Sea of Galilee, was close enough to the ocean where they could actually, and this was true, it became true, it was prophecy, that they could actually do a lot of business over the ocean with other nations. They made their money by the sea. Verses 14 and 15, Issachar, another brother, is a strong donkey, lying down between two burdens. He saw the rest was good, or that rest was good, and that the land was pleasant. He bowed his shoulder to bear a burden and became a band of slaves. It's a weird one. Issachar, strong, like a donkey. Donkey's a good animal. And so he carries the burden, he works, he's been blessed. He enjoys the pleasant land, but he becomes a slave. What happens? Well, Issachar, their tribe and their land is in an area where when you go to Israel, you can see, we stand up on the mountain, we look down on Megiddo. It's the breadbasket of Israel. It's this place that's so fertile. It's like it provides food for that nation and so many others. It's just, it's farmland. They grow bananas there. They grow everything there. It's amazing. And that was the land that they inherited. That was their portion. You just drop some seeds in the ground, things grow. And in that blessing, in that strength, in that burden, what's he saying? Well, you kind of enjoyed that comfort and that pleasantness, and it made you lazy. And you became slaves. Because so often that's what blessings do to people. It's a sad thing to think that an overwhelming abundance, having so much, doesn't turn us into people that are better, but sometimes it can turn a person into something that's worse. It kind of fosters an attitude of, hey, I don't want to do anything else. It reminded me of the story of an old mountaineer and his wife. They're sitting in front of a fireplace in the night. They're just kind of spending some time together. And after a long silence, the wife says to her husband, I think it's raining. Get up and go outside and look. And the old mountaineer says, he looks at the fire and says, well, can't we just call the dog in, see if it's wet? Because that's kind of like, I just don't even want to get up and move anymore. And that is sometimes the attitude that takes place in our hearts when things get a little too easy, and that's what we believe happened to Issachar. They became slaves because of the goodness that they had. Verses 16 through 18 and verse 21, we see a different group of sons. And these are the sons not of Leah, but of Bilhah. Bilhah was, I believe, Rachel's daughter, or Rachel's handmaid, excuse me. Verse 16, Dan shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. Dan shall be a serpent by the way, a viper by the path, that bites the horse's heels, so that its rider shall fall backward. I've waited for your salvation, O Lord. So the tribe of Dan is noted as a tribe that will do two things. Number one, they will judge. And of course, they had some judges that came from Dan, most significantly being a guy named Samson. But they would also be like a snake in the grass. They would be like the snake that trips the horse that causes the rider to fall. In other words, they're going to cause people some problems. And of course, what are the problems that Dan brought into the nation? Well, Dan is the one that introduced idolatry to the nation. It was the tribe of Dan that brought that in. Judges 18, verse 30. And when the nation split and the northern tribes created basically their own religion, one of the false altars was in the location of Dan's tribe, according to 1 Kings chapter 12. And so Dan had its place and its part in bringing problems upon the nation. Then verses 19 and 20, we have the daughters of Zilpah. Gad, a troop shall tramp upon him, and he shall triumph at last. And then verse 20, the bread from Asher shall be rich, and he shall yield royal dainties. Oh, that's nice. And so the daughters of Zilpah are Gad and Asher. Gad, it says of Gad that he's going to get stepped on. He's going to get trampled. And that's true. And the reason why it's true is because The people were supposed to cross the Jordan River and go into the promised land. But 2.5 tribes didn't cross the river. They stayed on the east side of the Jordan. They didn't cross over, because that picture of crossing over the Jordan River is not the picture symbolically of the believer going to heaven. It's the picture of the believer moving from the carnal life into the spirit-filled life, the abundant life. And so, although the other tribes went in, 2.5 tribes didn't. And Gad was one of those tribes. And so they got stepped on a lot. They didn't cross over the Jordan. They were in a place of vulnerability. And so they got stepped on. Now, ultimately, they get the victory, but they did get trampled on a lot. And of course, Asher, well, there's not much to say. They were cooks. And there's nothing wrong with being a cook, but that's what they were known for, is just, if you want to eat, go visit Asher. The name means happy. I guess that makes sense. If you're happy, you're eating. And so verses 22 through 27. Now we get to the daughters of Rachel, which of course would be Joseph and Benjamin. And of course, Jacob has the best things to say for Joseph, because we've followed this story. He hasn't seen him in years and years and years. He was the favorite son who he thought was dead and is now alive, and he's keeping everybody alive. He's saving the world. And so he has so many good things to say about Joseph. Verse 22, Joseph is a fruitful bough by a well. His branches run over the wall. He says, Joseph, you're a fruitful man. You're like a tree that is planted by a well. If you're a tree, you don't get a better spot than that. You've got an underground supply of water that will keep you fresh and vibrant and fruitful no matter what. He says, Joseph, you're a fruitful bough. You're like a tree planted right next to a well. And the thing that marks Joseph is the same thing you could read about in Psalm 1. The tree that is planted by the river. And it's just fruitful all the time, because it's just rooted in something that will always supply, always provide. And that, Joseph's strength was his relationship with God. Joseph was planted by a well because he was watered by the Lord. And because he was watered by the Lord, he could be fruitful all the time. Guys, that is the same thing that works for you and I today. If we are planted in God's word, if we're planted and invested in our relationship with God, you are planted by a well, you're not going to run dry. But when you uproot and say, I think I'm going to plant myself somewhere else, and you find yourself in the middle of a barren desert, and there's no water there, it's hostile, there's no encouragement, and then one day you scratch your head and go, why are things so dry? And why is everything falling apart? And why is everybody always upset and uptight and mad? And why is all this flesh coming out? It's like, where are you planted? Are you planted by the well? Are you planted in the middle of a desert? He says, Joseph, you are planted by the well, and because of that, he says, your branches have run over the wall. In other words, your fruitfulness extends beyond your own borders. One of my neighbors has a tree, and this tree is growing wild. I'm so glad they're not my next door neighbor, because they're my next door neighbor, I think we're going to have some issues. But this tree is just like shooting into the neighbor's house, covering the neighbor's garage, covering everything. It's like, wow, that tree is like massive. That would be such a bummer. Unless it was an avocado tree. If it was an avocado tree, I'd be all right with that. But to me, it's like that's just the growth. What happens when you're fruitful is that you just expand over the wall. You have something to share. Verse 23, the archers have bitterly grieved him. shot at him and they hated him. Of course, he had a lot of people shooting at him. He had his brothers. He had Potiphar's wife. He had the servants in jail that just left him there. He had a lot of people against him, shooting at him. But notice this, but his bow remained in strength, and his arms, the arms of his hands were made strong, or really supple, or flexible by the hands of the mighty God of Jacob. From there is the shepherd and the stone of Israel. By the God of your father who will help you, and by the Almighty who will bless you with blessings of heaven above, blessings of the earth, of the deep that lie beneath, blessings of the breast and of the womb. The blessings of your father have excelled the blessings of the ancestors upon the utmost bound of the everlasting hills. They shall be on the head of Joseph and on the crown of the head of him who was separate from his brothers. Joseph, not only are you fruitful, but even when people were firing at you, even when your own brothers were throwing you in a pit, even when you were left in prison, he says your hands were made strong by the hand of God because you trusted the Lord. And the idea when he says your hands were made supple or strong is the fact that he says you were flexible, you were usable. I can understand this because the idea behind it is, like, if you've ever played a guitar before, how many of you have ever attempted to play guitar at one point in your life? Some of you? A few of you? And when you just start out, it's so hard because you can't get your fingers to do anything. You tell them to make this chord and they say no. And you force them. You have to fight with them to get them into the position that they're supposed to be in because they're not supple. They're resistant. But at some point, you relax, and then somebody can take your hand, and they can say, you put your finger here, you put your finger here, and you put this finger here. It's like, oh, yeah, that's nice, that works. And you see, that's the same thing. That's the idea, is that he didn't fire back, but because he was trusting in the Lord, he could be flexible, he could be usable, he could be that person that God could use in every situation. And that is why you and I don't do well taking revenge. That's what he's talking about here. Some of us get revenge in a very upfront way. Kind of they just go right after you. They'll get back in your face in a second. And other people are kind of more that passive aggressive. I don't get mad, I just get even. Find a way, You'll walk out and all four tires of your car will be flat. Something I'm going to get you somehow. Either way, it's bad. Either way. Because we're taking things in our own hand and not trusting the Lord, who is a better defender of us than we will ever be of ourselves. But Joseph could say, hey, you know what? I have my brothers right where I wanted them. These dogs came and they were begging from me. They needed food and they didn't know who I was. I had all the power. I could have destroyed them. But what did he do? He restored them. He restored his family. He restored the relationship. He saved his family. He restored his relationship with his dad. I mean, it's an amazing thing because as we're going to see in the next time when we wrap up the book, God was working in the whole situation. And he realizes that. And so when we see Joseph, the oldest son of Rachel, we see a guy that's so much a picture of Jesus. But then verse 27, we get to the last child, the youngest child. And even though he was a child of Rachel, which would make him in Jacob's eyes a very special kid. In fact, we know as the youngest, as the baby boy, it's like, Dad was ready to give up on Simeon, leave him in jail just to protect Benjamin. You remember that? It's like, oh, that's Simeon. He was a sure nice guy to have around, but I'm not letting Benjamin go. I mean, that's how he felt about him. But notice what he says about him. It's interesting to me. He says, Benjamin is a ravenous wolf. In the morning he shall devour the prey, and at night he shall divide the spoil. Not exactly the greatest blessing you ever see in your life. The Benjamites were tough dudes. They were fighters. They were the guys you wanted with you if you were going to battle. And so there's not much to say other than, Benjamin, you're one tough dude. You're a fighter. But then in verses 28, going on through the end of the chapter, he says all these are the 12, first time we describe them this way, the tribes of Israel. Each of these men become a tribe. And this is what their father spoke to them. He blessed them. He blessed them each one according to his own blessing. And so sometimes blessings come in ways that are a little bit harsh. Sometimes the biggest blessing is having somebody tell you the truth right to your face, even if it hurts. And I could say at least 3 of them, maybe 4 of them, had that truth thrown right in their face. It's a reality, but it was a blessing. Then, verse 29, he charged them and said to them, I am to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite, in the cave that is in the field of Machpelah, which is before Mamre in the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought with the field of Ephron the Hittite as a possession for a burial place. And they buried Abraham and Sarah his wife. There they buried Isaac and Rebekah his wife. And notice this, so important, there I buried Leah. The field and the cave that is there were purchased from the sons of Heth. And so he's in Egypt, right? Egypt is the place where they built pyramids. And pyramids were just big tombs, right? We know that. This is the place, as the father of Joseph, the most powerful man in the world next to Pharaoh, this is the place, if you want to be entombed forever, have your own pyramid built, this is the place. But he says, I'm not an Egyptian. My home is back in Canaan, so take me home and bury me where I belong. Put me with my people. I belong with my people. That's what he's saying. I belong with my people. Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, my family, the people that share the common faith with me, and Leah. Now remember, he had 2 wives, right? First wife was Leah, second was Rachel. Who do you love more? Rachel. Rachel was the one he got tricked into marrying Leah. Remember that whole wedding night thing, full gown, full thing, and he wakes up in the morning and, woo, who are you? Leah. Why'd you do that to me? Because in these parts, we can't let the younger sister get married before the older one does. So you have to marry her, work for me 7 more years, and you can have the younger one. Deal. He works 14 years for Rachel. Kind of gets stuck with Leah. But it's interesting, because after a lifetime of living, he could have been buried anywhere he wanted. And we know that, at least at first, my heart belongs to Rachel. But now he says, but bury me with Leah. Something happened in his heart where he realized that, you know what? I'm glad I stuck with her. I'm glad I didn't just get stupid and bail out. Because if I didn't stick with this gal, there would be no Judah. If there's no Judah, there's no Lion of the tribe of Judah. So he looks back and goes, hey, you know what? It didn't make sense then, but it makes a lot of sense now. And so you know what, guys? Bury me with Leah. Bury me there. There's just something to be said for that as he says goodbye. Lastly, verse 33. And when Jacob had finished commending his sons, he drew his feet up into the bed and breathed his last and was gathered to his people. I mean, I just see that in my mind. he's sitting there on the edge of his bed talking to his sons. They're all gathered around him. And he says, that's it. And he just pulls up his feet into the bed, pulls the covers up, closes his eyes, and he's gone. Just like that. And it says he was gathered to his people. He went home to be with the people who went before him and to be with the one who created him. That's the step that every human being takes. That's what I hope we will live in light of. Don't live for just today. Don't live as if today in the short term is the only thing that matters. I think when we actually get there and we stand before Jesus, we're going to realize that, you know what? The life lived for him was the only thing that mattered. And the boat, the RV, the bigger house, the vacation home, it didn't matter. It was not that big of a deal. But what really mattered is the one that I'm standing before right now. He was gathered to his people. And so, my brothers and sisters, think big. And when I say think big, what I'm saying is think in light of what is eternal, not what's temporary. Because what's temporary is just that. It's temporary. It doesn't last. But what's eternal? Man, what a difference. And so, one more chapter to go. Genesis 50. It'll be a while before we get there. We've got a lot of things going on between now and then. But take some of these lessons to heart. Let's pray. Father, we thank you. We thank you for your mercies. We